Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. All right. Well, it is a great pleasure for me to be here today and talk on this topic, because frankly, I can't imagine a more important topic, especially in the realm of the COVID pandemic. So let's just hop straight into where we're going with things here today. And let me just restate my overall goal. And that goal is really to equip you, the participants who are listening in from around the world, to help you enact initiatives that will help individuals, especially women, achieve work-family balance. And as Renata has said, this is something that I've been working on for about 20 years, although most of that has been undertaken in sort of weird, that is, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies. I'm going to do my best to also chime in and talk about how that may unfold in other parts of the world, but I really want to be able to equip you in leading and enhancing people's lives. So the primary way that I'm going to go about doing that over the course of the next 15 or 20 minutes is, first of all, to simply touch on and talk about a few focal topics. And the first focal topic is that of alternative views of work-family balance. We need to really make sure that we understand what work-family balance is if we're going to try to change it and if we're going to try to facilitate it. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know about the connections between work-family balance and different aspects of well-being, whether that's at the individual level or at the level of families and or social groups. Then, and most importantly, it's the dominant feature of the presentation today, that is presenting some distinctive strategies for pursuing work-family balance with a few implications for technology. I'm really going to leave it to Susan to talk about technology more broadly writ, but I did want to connect some of my comments specifically to technology. So let's get started with that. The first place that I want to begin with is basic perspectives on work-family balance. And by and large, the dominant view of work-family balance is really the absence of interference. The idea here is that if anybody tries to engage in one domain of activity, such as participating in paid work, it's going to ultimately lead to negative consequences for another domain of life, such as family. And so what's attempted to be illustrated by this chessboard is that there's only one winner. There's no way for both work and family to be beneficial. However, in the last 15 years or so, there's been a new view on what work-family balance is, and that's sort of this idea of either enrichment or facilitation. And here the fundamental idea is that individuals can be engaging in multiple roles simultaneously. In the current context, that is engaging in both work-related responsibilities and family-related responsibilities, and that those responsibilities can in fact have synergistic effects for the individuals involved, as well as the family members that are connected to those individuals, as well as the workplaces that are connected with those individuals. Finally, more of a middle-of-the-road place with regard to your perspective on work-family balance is sort of this notion of it's not necessarily that there's problems there, or it's also not necessary for there to be strengths or synergies there, but rather it's just the basic idea of being able to meet your basic work and family responsibilities. One doesn't win and one doesn't lose, but there also isn't any inherent ideas that we can grow to higher levels of complexity or somehow have everything at the same time. So those are the three dominant perspectives, frankly, around the world on what work-family balance is. And there is substantial variation from cultural context to cultural context about whether or not each of these items or which of these is most appropriate. In some cases, the notion of being able to just meet your everyday work and family responsibilities makes sense because essentially work is a means to benefiting family. So there's no way that work could actually harm family, recognizing that most households these days require earnings in order to meet their family responsibilities. So that's sort of one view of work-family balance. But then in other places, again, particularly in weird contexts like Western educated, democratic, rich, and oh nuts, I've just lost it, the last one of those. But anyways, in those weird contexts, here the idea is that we're looking for an idealized scenario where we can have the perfect, picture perfect family life as well as the picture perfect work life. So with those perspectives in place, let's move on then to being able to think about how we might go about promoting work-family balance. And there's really four main hypotheses that you can think about. And the notion of hypotheses isn't intended to get people thinking about research, but rather to get us thinking about what we might be able to do about that. And so the fundamental thesis that underlies the priority hypothesis of work-family balance is essentially the idea that meeting work and family responsibilities is a primary task for adulthood, right? So no matter where you are in the world, every adult wants to do right by their work, their paid vocation, as well as for the individuals that they're responsible for in their home, regardless of whether they're children, parents, siblings, or otherwise. And so if we're going to pursue this kind of hypothesis, if we're going to view work-family balance from this point of view, our goal is to try to eliminate forced choices between work and family. And early on in the United States, this was a common feature of trying to avoid the challenge of raising children for working women by essentially creating childcare facilities that provided high quality care at an affordable cost. That would be an example of eliminating a forced choice between work and family so that you can accomplish both in the same time period. Another solution towards accomplishing that is to be able to support threatened priorities. And so in some cases, if we cannot provide childcare facilities, for example, there may be financial incentives, perhaps they're tax deductions, perhaps there are various items that if you can't afford them or if they can't be provided directly, there's at least the opportunity to support those initiatives in some alternative kind of way. And then the third one is the possibility of redefining priorities. And in some parts of the world, we see this happening right now. So for example, in some of the Middle Eastern countries, there's an attempt to become updated and to create, really global kinds of economies by encouraging all individuals to participate in that local economy, even if historically they were underrepresented. And so that's a concrete strategy where we're trying to redefine the priorities that says, look, maybe it's highly appropriate not for women to be at home anymore, but now, in fact, we want them in the labor force. They're a valued part of the overall workforce. So that would be an example of trying to redefine what the priorities are. Then we've got a second hypothesis that's out there, and that would be the synergy hypothesis. And here, work and family are viewed as complementary spheres of everyday life. And so therefore, it's beneficial to see to it that people can be effectively engaged in each of those ideas. And here, the idea is that we're trying to exploit key leverage points for helping people be successful in both work and family. And probably the best example of this around the globe right now are initiatives for educating girls and women. All of those attempts are guided in part by the goal of seeing to it that there's equality for women so that they're able to enter the workforce, and thereby creating the opportunity for growth, not only for the families, but also for the individuals and for the societies themselves. And that's where we also see a nice concrete example of aligning public and private priorities. But another important element of that synergy hypothesis is, again, the ability to eliminate impediments to people actually pursuing those additional or those new responsibilities. And again, paid childcare or providing some sort of a provision for childcare is probably the best example of this that we see worldwide. That is, there's always children. Whenever there's going to be individuals who are having babies, there's going to be children that need to be taken care of. And in the absence of good care, it's going to be exceedingly difficult for individuals to engage in both paid work and family. Now, the third hypothesis is the idea of the time bind. And here, the fundamental thesis is that there's insufficient time to meet both the responsibilities of work and family. Now, this is really sort of a structural hypothesis, and really the main solution is that we need to find times to, quote unquote, make time. And the best example of this that we see around the world are aspects of flex time, right? Where you bend the schedule in some way, shape, or form to make time for family, even though it maybe had previously been attributed to work, or vice versa. Another strategy is by pursuing efficiencies. And so if we view time as a commodity, a limited commodity that every individual has, well, one way of making time is to make sure that some of the activities that we're engaging in are made more efficient in some way, shape, or form. And then the last one is that we can also help people better manage time in some way, shape, or form. And whether that's in the form of making sure that they don't become overextended, making sure that the expectations that are placed on individual workers or on individual parents or on individual family members, making sure that those are all appropriate for the task at hand. Those are all concrete solutions to a time-bound kind of approach to work-family balance. And then the last one is really the strain hypothesis. And here the fundamental idea is that it just simply is not possible to do both work and family successfully. And I'm not going to pretend to know what it's like around the world, but I can tell you that upwards to until about the 1970s in the United States, that was the predominant view of life here in the United States, is that it's best if men were going to take on sort of the work role and women were going to take on the family role and the expressive needs of families. And the concrete explanation for that, or the solution, was that of sort of complementary specialization. The idea is that society works best when some people specialize in one aspect of society, like paid work, whereas other people specialize in other aspects of society, like raising children. And so therefore, in this situation, balance is not a function of the individual, but rather balance is a family issue. A family makes a decision about the best way to meet its caretaking needs while also its consumption needs in the marketplace. It also is important to recognize from this point of view that it's important to mitigate or to build supports for any kind of strains that may be in place. Because again, the idea here is if there is in fact too much responsibility, well, whatever that can be done to mitigate those strains, whether it's in the form of EAP, employee assistance programs, whether it's in the form of flexible benefit options, whether it's in the form of childcare resource and referral, all of those are supports that may mitigate the strain that individuals are ultimately encountering. Now, I want to spend a few minutes talking about how all these pieces ultimately get to well-being and health, because of course, that's a fundamental part of sustainable development. And so let's just piece it together a little bit by saying we're going to begin with work-family balance, no matter how it's defined. You can use any of the definitions that I gave you. But the predominant view is that work-family balance ultimately leads to some set of behaviors, and whether that's behaviors like exercise and diet, whether it's behaviors like connecting with other individuals or lifelong learning or being charitable in some way, shape, or form. These are all behaviors that are presumed to be benefited by work-family balance and the corresponding psychological and physiological responses that go along with them. Now, those intermediary points then are in turn believed to contribute to well-being. And notice well-being is a multifaceted phenomenon. So when I say well-being, I'm not just referring to physical health. I'm also talking about an individual's personal meaning in life. I'm talking about the overall quality of relationships that may be in families or in societies, as well as a host of other different dimensions. The key point that's here, though, and it's probably overly simplified in this depiction, is that clearly, just like you would never go to a psychiatrist for heart surgery, likewise here, you want to make sure that if you're targeting some aspect of physical health, for example, you're thinking about the aspect of work-family balance that's most relevant to physical health. So something like strain may be highly relevant to physical health, but synergy may be less relevant to physical health, but it may be more useful for cognitive ability or for coming up with new ideas or problem solving or something along that line. So it's really important to make sure that we're thinking about and aligning, well, which well-being or domain of well-being are we fundamentally after with our initiative, and then make sure that we wrap it to our work-family balance. Now, I see that I'm growing short on time, and so I'm going to skim through some of the remaining slides that I have because they are about the implications of technology. And really all I want to point out here is that each one of the hypotheses that I put forward does have corresponding implications for technology. So right now just about the whole world recognizes that there's remote work, and that was originally put in place in response to the priority hypothesis. We were trying to help people achieve both their work and family responsibilities at the same time. And we figured if we could reduce the time that was necessary for travel and that sort of thing, we could help people be effective in meeting all of their responsibilities. But of course, technology and the availability of things on the World Wide Web also give us opportunity for expanding resources, whether they're family resources, social services resources. And each of those things are good things. Technology can enhance work-family balance in some way, shape, or form. But as we're also learning, though, in the midst of the COVID pandemic, that remote working can also result in feelings of feeling isolated. And as we develop new ways of doing things, we get on what some people refer to as the hedonic treadmill, where the new normal all of a sudden is no longer satisfying. We want something different. And each of those can have negative consequences, regardless of whether they're being pursued through remote work or through the lack of connection because we're having only social interactions over the web or elsewhere or otherwise. Likewise, the next hypothesis about trying to solve or resolve the time bind, clearly trying to save time and saving money is oftentimes a good thing, and being more efficient with our resources, whether it's through a computer program or more efficient meetings, those are good things. But at the same time, they can also blur boundaries and create confusion of the individual if they're bombarded with too many things at the same time. If we consider aspects for the synergy hypothesis, likewise, again, there's great things that can happen through technology, like we can better solve puzzles to create new solutions for the world. And we can, in fact, find leverage points that allow us to be more successful and get more things accomplished. And again, those are good things. But there's also the possibility of having a point of no return. And as Neil Postman once said, there's no such thing as not having technology without consequences. The best we can do is just try to anticipate unanticipated consequences and plan for them as best we can. And then lastly, in the strain hypothesis, we also recognize that, again, there is value in having multiple people with different specializations working together on the same problem, but each of those also creates problems. And that is, sometimes it creates inequalities, and it creates the notion or the possibility that for some people there's a choice, but for other people there's obligations that are being played. And of course, that creates opportunities for oppression and all sorts of inequality. So all of these aspects of technology have both possible benefits and possible negative implications that require careful attention beforehand. And so in summary, over the course of the last 15 to 17 minutes or so, I've tried to deliver really 3 or 4 main points. The first point is that the idea of work-family balance really has several distinctive meanings. And if we're going to try to bring it about, if we're going to try to initiate actions, we need to make sure that we are familiar with the local cultural views of what balance is. And then especially if we're using balance as a mechanism for sustainable development, as a way of promoting health and well-being, we have to recognize that there's going to be very deliberate connections among those concepts. And then lastly, I tried to communicate a variety of very generic strategies that can be used to promote work-family balance. But the important piece is, depending on how you understand work-family balance in your part of the world, it may be necessary to select different tools to bring that about. And of course, information technology can assist with that, but can also create impediments. And so it's really important to watch out for unanticipated consequences. And that brings me to a close. So I am going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Susan.
Yes. Let me, thank you, Professor Grzywacz. Thank you so much. I am grateful for your perspective on, for gender perspective. I'm grateful for warning us about the unintended implications of technology, and that we have to really work different experts have to work on different aspects of technology, and especially the local view of what work-family balance is. I think it's not always recognized. I mean, we have this kind of Western perspective about what work-family balance should be, and there are a lot of local understandings of what the balance actually is. Now we will move to Professor Susan Walker, and she's an associate professor of family social sciences at the University of Minnesota. She holds a PhD in child and family studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The emphasis of her teaching and research is on technology integration in family education, early childhood parenting and childcare policy, and parent learning through social interactions. This work extends her 30-plus years of research and teaching on parenting and in parenting education. She designed and currently teaches an undergraduate course on families and technology, one of the very few such courses in the United States. She is currently writing an open source textbook spanning technologies, influences on families in societies, impacts on children and family relationships, and the preparation of family professionals. Digital technology and media offers families and employers new tools to fulfill roles and responsibilities across traditional boundaries of space and time. New ways of working also means new ways of balance work and family demands. Professor Walker's presentation is to identify what work-family balance in the digital age looks like in its many iterations, globally and culturally, and the complications in crafting policy and practice response. Professor Walker, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And let me share my screen as well. It's really wonderful to be here this morning. Thank you very much to the United Nations. Thank you, Joe. That was a phenomenal presentation, and I can just pick up where you left off and explore more deeply on digital technologies. And thank you to everyone who is here today for taking your time on this, what we all believe is a very, very important topic. So the New York Times ran a series last week called The Primal Screen. And as you can see here with the picture from one of the series, there's a wonderful image of a mother who is fighting for space, and she is using her digital technologies to manage her work responsibilities. Meanwhile, her child is nearby, and she is also trying to facilitate parenting the best way that she can. We take a look at this poor mother, and we immediately can identify with some of the concepts that Joe was just mentioning: stress and strain and divided attention. And what we see here is also sort of that erosion of traditional work boundaries of time and space to be able to fulfill all of these obligations for work and for family at home. So it's important, and also Joe mentioned this, that our perceptions about what we mean by work and family have really changed through the decades. I have a picture here from the 1950s, 1960s, and I tell my own students about when I was growing up. You know, our world was very much bounded with dads went to work and moms were at home raising children. And it was very defined, again, by time and by place, but also by gender role. If work and family, there was a spillover, it meant that my father had some work in a briefcase and maybe he opened that briefcase. But certainly times have changed, certainly with the entry of women to the workforce, but also to the wide variety of ways that we imagine what work and family balance looks like. I will also echo, and you'll hear me mention this a number of times, Joe's warning that our research is really limited in this area. So it's been relegated to certain countries and certain contexts and certain cultures, and we clearly need to know more. So our work family recommendations in the past to assist with this challenge of dividing attention and being able to fulfill the obligations of both work and family that would create this kind of strain have largely been structural. So what I have here is an indication from a report from almost 10 years ago at the United Nations by O'Brien that indicates recommendations related to flexible hours, again, paternal leave, more child care supports, but also recommending a stronger focus on families. Much of the research and much of the focus is on work productivity, and is work still being done? But we need to continue to remember that those workers do have families, and we can't ignore the impacts on the family. We also need to pay attention to particularly those workers, particularly women, and those who may be in jobs that are less flexible, to families who largely have been marginalized and have received less of our attention. So again, this variety of supports has been recommended. And actually, if you look at some of the recommendations during COVID, many of these work-family balance recommendations look very much the same. And of course, these recommendations are not just focused alone on the worker, but they have systemic effects. So by providing quality childcare, children are benefiting in terms of their health, their education. It gives parents peace of mind, and it helps them focus. So when we think of the Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations, our efforts towards providing structural supports for work and family balance have a multitude of impacts. There's also been an examination of some of these workforce benefits through the years. Some reports, say from OECD countries looking at the success of some of these strategies, have indicated that they are somewhat successful in terms of an increased female presence in the workforce, and yet we're not perfect, right? Things have not been accomplished as well as we might like to, and for a number of reasons at the workplace level, administration, institutional, that some of these efforts to increase women's productivity have not come to place. So as we turn our attention then from what has been our traditional focus on work and family balance in our attempt to try to establish this assistance to families to manage these role demands, we now take a closer look at the role of technology. And primarily when we look at, and when I say ICT, as Renata mentioned, this is information and communications technologies. We're examining their affordances. So the affordances of using the internet, the affordances of using a mobile device that helps us transcend, again, that boundary of time and space, that allows us to really do work or really attend to home anytime and any place. But this also means a shift in our economies. It also means a shift in our employment opportunities. It also means a shift in the expectations from employers and from workers in terms of where and how work gets done. As there's been a lot of attention to an individual trying to do this balance, I would say that what I often hear from a lot of the professionals that I work with is that their employers have increased the demand. Their employers have eroded those boundaries by expectations that they work over the weekend, or they respond to that email on a Sunday morning or something like that. I include a few pictures that represent, again, this balance, and I particularly noticed this one in the center. This was an ad from Silicon Valley that was pulled down pretty quickly, but with this idea that I rarely get to see my kids, but that's just a risk you have to take, when they realize the impact of this message about work over family. So as I mentioned about shifting economies and employment opportunities, we also have to recognize that not only are we limited in our understanding about traditional sort of 9-to-5 jobs, but also what this means to new forms of work that individuals with families may have. So when we think about mobility, but we also think about stability of jobs or precarity of jobs. And our traditional sense, maybe as we look at the mother in the closet trying to balance everything, we may consider her a 9-to-5er, right? Someone whose job is relatively stable. She usually does that job at a desk in a workplace, but now she's doing it at home. Versus someone who is part of the gig economy, who makes a formal contract for service. Say, think of an Uber driver, or the digital nomad, someone who is able to really work anywhere, anytime around the world, and prefers that style of being able to work. So the important thing is that we keep in mind that not only is technology affecting us individually and affecting maybe our places of work and how we do work, but also it is also shifting the economy, and it's shifting work opportunities for families. So as Joe mentioned, we've had some early research on, and by early, I'm talking about within about the last 10 years or so, that has looked at primarily the use of cell phones and this more mobile work life. And as Joe mentioned, we see some pros and cons. So we see from, again, offering more flexibility and autonomy in terms of where and how work gets done, the fulfillment of role obligations, being able to take time off to care for take the child to a doctor, for instance. It can also mean higher job satisfaction for the individual and keep that individual in their job longer, right? Because they have a more autonomous workplace. On the other hand, it can also mean that that employee can be reached more often, and higher employer demands for that individual trying to balance everything. It can mean role overwhelm, stress. It can also impact the mental health, family satisfaction, jobs, and the picture that I have here includes also what Joe was mentioning in terms of intrusions or interference. This is sort of our classic idea of taking work with us, is that our children will get ignored or our vacations will be ruined. This has spawned words like technoference and phubbing as we've turned our attention to what the possibilities of technology on our attention. But I caution that our research is greatly challenged, and we are just in the very, very early stages of really understanding what these flexible technologies for work and home might mean. Partly, we need to keep in mind that technology is changing very, very rapidly. The first web page was introduced 30 years ago in 1991. Social media really took off in about 20 years ago. And when we think about smartphones, well, smartphones were also introduced about 20 years ago, but they didn't reach 50% or more of ownership until about 2014. That's only 7 years ago for us to really have an understanding about what these devices might mean to the permeability of work and family boundaries. There has also been, and I can tell you as someone who researches technology, you can have your research on a particular device or format, and then everything changes and people are no longer using it. And it can be very, very frustrating. Also, there is such wide global variation in technology access. So again, our understanding is very, very limited. There's such a variation in technology use. There is also high variation in technology use at the workplace. This is just one example of how worldwide our technology access varies. This indicates the darker shaded countries are those that have more developed economies and those that have a higher access rate to the internet. So again, our research is cautioned based on who has access to the internet, who has access to these mobile technologies, and how those are integrated into the type of work that people are doing. So our research in this area, just to give you an idea too of how early we are in understanding this and moving beyond sort of this pro and con of interference, is really taking a look at what are the precursors or what are the influences on whether or not or how we might use technology for work and family balance, and what might moderate or what might affect whether or not using technology for work and family balance might have a particular impact. So all of this is a summary of a number of the variables that have been looked at in research over the last 10 years. And again, it just depends. We really are at a very early stage of understanding this. But one thing that you can see in both of these is that we're still focused on the three dimensions of the impact on the individual, the impact on the family, and the impact on the workplace. And we can also see, as we look in here more closely, individual differences. So as we're looking at this, what's being called new ways of working is this idea of shifting conditions that are far more flexible, but also permeable, meaning that where we do work might shift from doing work at home or homework at work. We are also interested in worker agency and autonomy in terms of making determinations of when and where work gets done. I can tell you that my students, a more millennial generation, is very happy to be able to call the shots. They are very happy to have that kind of flexibility. And this desire for flexibility really is present in our growing workforce. And yet there are potential consequences, attention being one of them. As if we, when I will work with my students and I'll ask them about their use of cell phones and their smartphones, and 3/4 of them will admit an addiction or a feeling of addiction, a feeling of being glued to their phones. And phones and software on it is programmed, to keep our attention with notifications and constant scrolling and the gamification and that sort of thing. So there's kind of this, back and forth. And then what happens when we get what we want, right? When these boundaries are eroded and we have the flexibility and the autonomy, well, COVID-19 and our quarantine status is a natural experiment. And again, we come back to our image of the poor mother in the closet. So there has been a call for what's being termed digital cultural capital. This idea of awareness and motivation and skill to perform technology, but with boundary management, right? So if we've taken away the idea of time and space for where and how work gets done, somehow we need to reintegrate with our use of technology that idea of bounded time and space to keep sane, to keep our family obligations, and to keep our work obligations. So I'm going to finish with taking a look at some policy recommendations. So yes, there's a lot we don't know, but from what we do know, and when we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, we can ally some of these recommendations with them. So first of all, first and foremost, we need to continue research in this area. We have there's so many variables yet to explore, and we need to pay attention to the shifting needs for, again, women in the workforce, women who are bearing these multiple responsibilities, and for the different roles that technology is being used in terms of the balance. We also need to obviously continue the existing supports. As I mentioned, a lot of the supports recommended for COVID-19 still continue to focus on childcare, on flexible hours, flexible arrangements, things like that. And yet I might recommend that as we're looking at some of those traditional structural supports, that we might also question how technology might be involved. For instance, there are multiple apps now for finding childcare, for managing childcare arrangements, for communication and engagement between early childhood settings and families. So if technology is our friend and helps us with communication and creation and collaboration, why not put it to good use? We can also be looking at, again, these additional economic and work opportunities afforded by technology. And it would be good to have a global database. Now that we have, cloud computing and we have the opportunity for sharing, technology, again, can be our friend. We absolutely need to be looking at ways that we can foster a healthy and effective workplace culture with technology. A lot of my research with educators looks at their own workplace conditions and how they foster and promote more positive technology attitudes and comfort. Part of that is providing looking at the types of technology that is provided, making sure that it's adequate and reliable. I will say that from my reading on COVID-19, one of the largest benefits, employee benefits that has really been appreciated is when employers don't assume that we all have technology in our homes and easy internet access, but that they also provide stipends that employees can purchase technology. Training needs to level the playing field. We don't all come using technology with the same comfort levels, the same experiences, and training can do a lot to help with comfort. And finally, the technology policies at the workplace need to be not only articulated, but clear and reinforced. So often when employees are trying to use technology to fulfill their jobs, they're not really sure if there's going to be a firewall on access or if it's okay to do certain things because they haven't heard it yet from their employer. So these are just some ways that technology at the workplace can be more supportive. We also need to keep in mind that as technology continues to innovate, we can't forget privacy and safety and what it's going to mean for the family. Because again, technology, one of the givens about technology, about digital media, is that it's going to continue to change. We're continuing to look at artificial intelligence and virtual realities. And as the workplace, as governments are using these technologies more, we also have to ask, but are they safe? And are they keeping us private? Because you also don't want workers that are going to worry about the privacy of their data or if they're being tracked or what's happening. And so, so as we innovate, and innovation can be a good thing, we also want to keep the privacy and safety of individuals in mind and not make that assumption that we all are perfect digital citizens. And then finally, and this I think is very, very important, as we're looking about what was termed last week again in an article in the New York Times about the attention economy, is really taking a look at this individual, whether it's the mother in the closet who is trying to do the balance, whether it's a millennial entering the workforce, but our attention is divided. And these technologies are helping, but they are also making it so much harder to attend to fulfill all of these responsibilities. And as we are losing our workplace culture, we do lose the socio-emotional sense of community. And so when we're on our own, right, it can just feel even more stressful. So 3 ways that we can do this. One is to promote this idea of digital cultural capital as a skill to be taught. In addition to teaching about technology, how do we use technology in ways that help us attend and bound our attention? We also can have educational supports, more tailored educational supports, possibly even as an employee benefit, so that as the individual is trying to do this balance of home and work, the workplace can offer, what are some applications that you can use, maybe timers or communication with your child care provider, but again, individual tailored educational supports. And then finally, what are some individualized work arrangements? In my world of education, the big words are around individualized learning, right? Because that's what technology affords us through creative tools, through collaborative tools, through using tools for communication, for archiving. And why I would very much expect that this is what's going to happen in the workplace as well. We have a generation of workers who are coming in expecting flexibility, who are expecting to use these tools. And so this is an opportunity for employers to also think about keeping those workers, keeping them engaged and keeping them highly productive, but possibly through more flexible, individualized work arrangements. And so coming back to the New York Times, back in April, when we were all starting with our COVID quarantine, they had some solutions for parents back then, and that was around setting boundaries. Excuse me. If we were going to be home, how can we as individuals find ways to set these boundaries? So again, just returning to my 5 recommendations, and as we think systemically, as we think about what the Sustainable Development Goals for the United Nations is trying to achieve, Each one of these can connect very nicely to education, to health, to innovation, to improved workplace, to gender equality. But we keep an open mind to what research and to keeping an idea to a better representation of the kind of work-life balance that is out there for the entire world. So with that, thank you very much. And again, it was a wonderful opportunity. I'll leave you with my final question with, if the future of work is flexibility, how can we as a society continue to keep the family first? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Walker. It was a fantastic presentation. Thank you for the recommendations. I mean, this is what we are seeking, recommendations. Our role is really to provide research, the conclusions of research, and then ask the governments to really do something about the issues we engage on. So so these are really essential recommendations that you offered, and I think that, as you said, we don't really know. We are at the beginning of this research on the impact of technology, and we really have a long way to go to really understand it and really be on top of it, because it changes so rapidly. So thank you so much. I would like to just say a few words to our French colleagues. I'm really sorry we don't have the interpretation into French. Je suis vraiment désolée, mais je peux vous assurer que nous avons le résumé de cette session à notre website. Now, we have some questions, and the first comes from Jacqueline Leduc, who is with Make Mothers Matter. She mentions the importance of unpaid work. She mentions a question to Susan, your idea about the database. It's a great idea. I agree with this. For my part, I mean, we can cooperate on the database. We already have a limited website where we post good practices in family policy making, and this is on the basis of the government's responses that we send. So the governments tell us what they are doing for specific family policy areas, and also UN entities and civil society. So we can definitely work on expanding this website on good practices. But Susan, if you have any idea maybe how to work on this database from the point of view of academics?
Thank you, Renata. I think, like with anything, it's once something exists and is an idea and has a process, it's easier for people to contribute to. And so there is so much knowledge that is out there, and so much from the research side, but also from the practice side, from the ways that policies are being enacted. As I mentioned, our research on OECD countries is that a lot of the policies are good and they've helped some, but there's a lot of factors that stand in the way. Well, I think those barriers need to be as well understood as the practical policies that are being put in place, right? Because that will start to show the differences in application of those policies by context. So I would say that the main thing is that if it was started, a group pulled together to really identify what the features of this would look like, and then, like any good technology, that it would be simple, and there would be good instruction on how you contribute to the database and any kind of vetting, for contributions to the database. But my primary recommendation would be that good thought go into the origination of it, and then that outreach to let people know that it's available and how they can contribute and how they can use it. Joe, do you have anything that you'd contribute on that?
The only thing that I'll contribute is it kind of boggles my mind a little bit. I mean, you know, the notion of a global repository, you know, like the researcher in me says all things come down to sampling and measurement. And if the measures, that is the data that are being put in, are not well refined and consistently put in, well, then the data will only be, you know, kind of, you know, haphazard in some way, shape, or form. And so that's where the definitions of, you know, simple things like what is information technology, or what is work-family balance, or what is actually meant by a policy that's pursuing, you know, gender equity or something along that line, that precision becomes so much more important, because otherwise it becomes, you know, it becomes interesting, but whether or not it's actionable data is another question.
Right. I totally agree. The devil's in the details. Yeah.
That's right. Okay. Yes. You're welcome to provide questions either in chat and Q&A boxes below. So our next question comes from Ilya Akhotnikov. Yes, I remember Ilya from the NCFR conference. Welcome. So the first question is for Dr. Grzybacz. What's research what is current research on women's attitude towards their employment? So do they prefer to stay at home, or work part-time, or being employed? So the preferences, if you have any data on this. And what type is associated with higher levels of women's mental health? Couple satisfaction or a sense of their well-being? That's very good question.
So it's a really good question, and I really appreciate it. And I was staring at it in the question and answer box there for a while, saying, how am I going to answer that question? But I'm going to answer it as any academic would, and that is, it depends. You know, the nature of what are the women's attitudes, it depends on where you are in the world. You know, we collected some data recently from some immigrants from Latin America, and it was very clear that a primary goal was to try to get women into the paid labor force, and in fact, women seem to want that. But then in other parts of the world where I've collected some data, it was also very clear that if given the option, women would rather stay home and raise their children in alignment with the cultural standards that are there, rather than break out of that particular responsibility. And so my sense is the wide diversity in the meanings and the value, the inherent value of being part of the paid workforce has still so much cultural variation in its meaning that it would be very difficult to actually quantify the question of what women's attitudes generally are. And then on top of that, as I've already explained in my earlier comments, you know, the notion that work and family are, quote, separate spheres of life is a very Western concept. In many parts of the world, work and family are not separate from one another. In underdeveloped parts of the world, family is part of the work that's being done on the family farm, for the local shop, for the local mercantile, whatever it is that they're working on. Work and family are fundamentally tied together. It's really only in more industrialized countries that the domains of work and family are actually separate from one another. And so again, that plays into the notions of what are the attitudes towards employment if we operationalize employment as, quote, working outside of the home, that's not part of the actual production of household activities. So again, it's very complicated, but nevertheless, at least in weird contexts, again, Western, educated, industrialized, democratic, and rich, you know, by and large, the preference for, and the outcomes for well-being is that women's engagement in the labor force is generally associated with better mental health and well-being. Their children do not die, you know, suffer dire consequences. We spent all of the 70s, 80s, and most of the 90s trying to answer that question. And as long as children are put in high-quality childcare facilities, their children do not suffer from moms being employed. We've overcome a blip or a bump in terms of men's well-being. You know, there was a time in the early 2000s where men were having somewhat of an identity crisis of who are we and what are we supposed to do with all these women in the labor force. It seems as though that's been balanced out. And so by and large, at least in, again, weird societies, it seems as though having women engaged in the labor force is good for everybody at the individual level, and the implications for that at the economic level seem to be rising to the point of, it's a sustainable model for an economy to see to it that every person who's willing and able to engage in the paid labor force should be allowed to do so.
Thank you so much, Professor Grzybacz. I see that we can follow up on this with Dr. Walker. Any research on women's preference towards virtual employment, full-time or part-time?
I saw that question. I was thinking about the responses as Joe was talking. The data that I've seen has been disaggregated for women also does reinforce a personal preference for flexibility and a preference for permeability and autonomy in terms of I know what I need to do, just give me the flexibility and I'll take care of it, right? And yet, but again, it largely depends on the woman, on the job, on the culture. And again, this idea of perception of balance is key. And again, if we get out of our idea of sort of a 9-to-5 job and the perception, I think it's also this idea of perception of stress and strain, because for many women, the work that is beyond 9-to-5, say working at the family store or working in a family restaurant or working in the family's farm, is not a bounded, work by 9-to-5. And that contribution over time is the contribution to the family, and that reduces stress because that's the perception, right? And so again, as Joe was saying, our expanded idea about preference and perception of stress, depending on the context, is very, very important. I think it's also, though, important when we think about women to think about the multiple roles that they do have beyond childcare, but also as care workers for elders and for other members of the family. Oftentimes, this will fall on their shoulders. And then the limitations of technology from the standpoint of accessibility or language. So that combination. So again, just throwing more variables into this, but on its face, yes, we all, women do prefer a more flexible, autonomous arrangement. And yet it depends on their request for that arrangement based on their perception of stress and their perception of need and who all they provide care for, but also their perception of how good the technology is to fulfill these functions. So again, another complicated response, but it just adds dimension to when we talk about folks' attitudes, how much they are really influenced and colored by their context.
If I could, I'd like to piggyback on that because it raises a really important point that I now wish I would have said during my formal remarks, and that is a fundamental challenge about understanding what work-family balance is trying to understand the question of, is it an individual phenomenon or a social phenomenon? Part of what we grappled with for a long time and picking up with on what Susan was just commenting on is, by and large, we frequently think about work-family balance as a perception, an individual's evaluation of how it's working. But we also know that people can be deluded, right? There's many times, especially in stereotypical Western society, where men think they've got great work-family balance, but it's because their wives are picking up the slack. So are they really balanced, yes or no? Or have they deluded themselves into thinking that they have balance? And so a key element, especially in areas where we see opportunities for oppression of women, or at least certainly not equality of women in various elements, is making sure that we're being responsive to, well, if work and family are in fact balanced, we have to ask the question, for whom? And if that balance is not present for all working adults in the household, what does that mean and who's responsible for it? I don't mean to, kind of make us go, we don't know anything, but I can tell you that the work-family literature has been dominated primarily by views of work-family balance as being an individual's appraisal of how things are going. How are they for me? But whether or not that's actually characterizing how well their work and family are balanced, or how well they fit, or how well they comport, comply with one another, whatever the metaphor is that we're using, it's very difficult to be able to know whether or not there in fact is balance there, or if somebody is being taken advantage of in some way, shape, or form.
And let me jump on that, because I so appreciate your saying that, Joe. Because from the individual standpoint, and again, when I look at my own students, when we look at the research with millennials, this is a generation that is coming up that is so comfortable using so many types of technologies, and by their own admission, again, will raise concern about their feelings of addiction. But very often the view can be very myopic. And so if you ask, an individual, it'll be like, I'm fine. I am handling all of this, but this is where I think as a group, say the United Nations, as a society, we need to step back and ask what the values are, like what also is important, because if the individual is focused on, a perception of balance that means the ignoring of that child in the closet, right? But for the sake of getting work done, and rightfully so, because it means more income for the family or whatever, as a society, don't we care about the well-being of that toddler, and that toddler engaging with others and having strong socio-emotional development and learning and things like that? And so, yes, as long as our focus is on the perception of the individual, it can help us create these individualized work settings. But at the same time, as a society, we need to come back to what our goals are. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you. We have a next question from Ignacio Socias. He's from IFFD, International Federation for Family Development. And how to promote the role of fathers in a more effective way? And do you think we can now take advantage of the situation with the pandemic and encourage fathers more? Because we have some data that, in some regions, there was an uptake in the household responsibility by fathers. And what would be the role of legislation for that? Both of you, who wants to go first?
I'm happy to give that a go first, and since I'm at least on the panel, I'm a father. so we'll take that N of one observation and sort of speak to it. I think it is a really excellent question, Ignacio, if I may refer to you by first name, because it really speaks to an underlying and perennial challenge that's out there, and that is, to what extent is this work-family balance thing a woman's phenomenon? I remember in 1998, I went to my first work-family conference that was sponsored by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation in Boston, Massachusetts. And it was co-sponsored by the Professional Business Women's Coalition or something like that. I don't remember the name of the organization. But I remember the president of that organization walked up to me and said, "It's so good to see a man interested in a woman's issue." So this perennial idea that work and family is fundamentally about women, and this speaks to another question that somebody later on mentions about sort of the divide between women and men about responsibilities for children and child bearing. This is a fundamental issue. Without resolving who is responsible for the provision of financial wherewithal within a household, no matter where in the world you are, and who is responsible for the nurturing and care for children. Clearly at the moment only women can have babies, but to suggest that only women can care for babies is an entirely different question. So without really addressing Ignacio's, without having an answer to Ignacio's question, it really strikes to the fundamental core of the whole issue. And that is, why is it such a gendered issue? Where are men by and large? And how does that get addressed if it needs to be addressed in some way, shape, or form? And clearly there's individuals on both sides of the camp that say it need not be, and others who say it does need to be addressed, but it is a fundamental issue. Again, just from some other research that I've done in different parts of the world, I can tell you that there's parts of the world where women don't want men involved, right? Because it's another headache, right? Not only do I have a new baby to take care of, but now I got to take care of this stumbling dad who doesn't know how to take care of the baby. So in some parts of the world, whether or not we want fathers to be more involved, at least in early childcare and that sort of thing, again, it's a complicated question about being able to resolve what's in society's best interest, as opposed to what might be in an individual family's best interest. But nevertheless, there clearly are technological solutions to that. I'll let Susan refer to that. She mentioned all sorts of apps, and I'm like, I got to check that out. I didn't realize that existed. So undoubtedly there are tools to help fathers become more engaged, and clearly legislation may be useful, but whether or not that legislation is mandated or whether or not that legislation is advocated and available, those are really sticky questions.
Thank you, Joe. And thanks for the question. Anytime we get off the mommy track and can focus on other caregivers of children and other family configurations, like I'm all about that. A lot of us in the family world are very ecological in our perspectives. And so I think about media representation and social construction of family roles, right? And so I think in one way is this continued idea of defining men and defining fathers in our media, in our social media, and just the images. I mean, a lot of us are very careful in the pictures that we select so that we are very gender representation, very, ethnically and racially and culturally. And so that's at the very least, I think, something at a wider level that we can do, because as we've certainly seen with social media, that repetition of messages helps to reinforce people's ideas, right? And so when we're shifting our perception about men's roles and fathers' roles, right, I think our media representation and our social media definitely can be a part of that. Structurally, in terms of legislation, certainly, and I would need to look at the literature on this more strongly, but in terms of family leave, right, I visited Iceland a number of years ago and did a lot of work with Iceland, and I was stunned to hear their family leave policies after the birth of a child that offered the first 3 months for the mother and the second 3 months, or maybe it was 6 months, for the partner, and then for the next 3 or 6 months, the family could choose which partner, had the leave. And so structural policies like that just open our idea so that it isn't a matter of you choose, oh, it must be the woman who takes more time off, right? And so definitely, I think taking a look at legislation from the standpoint of leaves is critical. I think there's also the idea, so that to me, though, legislation and policy is another message. It reinforces ideas about how people think about family roles and about the enactment of family roles. And then finally, in terms of, as Joe was saying, who wants roles to kind of stay as they are, I think that needs to be respected, because then we'll take a closer look at women's power. Because, if we look at gatekeeping, for instance, a lot of my research in the childcare world, there would be men who would show up at 3 o'clock to pick up their kids, and there'd be childcare directors who would go, did he lose his job? Right. But if a woman showed up, it'd be like, well, of course she's here. And when there would be some discussion about opening up men's roles, there were some women that were, like, this is my domain. This is what I do. Or mothers-in-law, or other women in the family that were the matriarchs of the family that hold down that power, because our society, that's the power we've given women, right, is in the domestic sphere. And so I think it's all very synergistic, that the more power that women have to be in the workplace will start to flex our messages about women's roles and men's roles. We also need to do a much, much better job about promoting fathers' roles, right? And promoting that fathers as caregivers can be as good as, Joe can say too, I mean, there's a lot of literature that sort of be like, can men be good parents? And she's like, of course they're good parents, right? But we can't ask the question in that way. Just as we're asking questions about gender orientation and race and is we can all be good parents, but we can't ask the question from a deficit model. So again, just from an ecological perspective, while there are good legislative policies around, especially around leave, I think that those also, though, contribute to wider social messages that start to push our ideas and embracement of men's roles.
So I raised my hand because as Susan was talking, as is oftentimes the case, something else pops into your head. And I really want to surface this because frankly, I think it's a fundamental question. And that is part of an underlying, let's just call it a macro, kind of view on this, is that societies are better when workplaces are strong. And clearly, every society needs a good economy, right? There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. And again, COVID has laid that bare about the intersection of the individual's ability to engage in an economy and the strength of that economy or the vulnerability of that economy to various issues. But part of what Susan just mentioned also made my mind, kind of flag a little bit and kind of say, but should that be the key driver that fundamentally shapes work and family? Why could it not be, we want to see to it that we have a just society, or that we have a society that sees to it that every child is raised in a manner that allows them to achieve their personal abilities, whatever that might mean. And whether that's on the back of earnings because somebody in the household earned it, or because it's something that society values onto itself and is willing to invest in, that's a very different way of thinking about work and family balance. Because right now, the fundamental question about work and family is, how do we do family when we've got all these work responsibilities? Nobody's asking the question, how do we do family, given the way we currently do work? Right? And that's a fundamental shift in how we think about work and family, and how really the underlying models that are inherent in the very way we think about this phenomenon is embedded in the idea of, well, but of course we have to work, right? So we can't get out of that. So now how can we make family fit that or balance with the way that we're working? And I just think in a venue like this, it's important to be thinking about alternative ways of conceptualizing the problem or the issue.
Sorry, and I'll just add to that, as we're conceptualizing, is children, right? Joe, something that you said in the heart of that I just wanted to pull out is I think what oftentimes does lose focus when we're talking about work and family, and then we look at individual and we look at workplace performance, we look at individual stress, is the child, right? And the research reviews on this bear it out, that we don't put enough emphasis in our research on work-family balance to look at child outcomes, to look at children's emotional development, children's educational development, and that sort of thing. But when we flip it around and we think about our society's values for children, for healthy children, then I think that too helps us reframe the questions about what is important to us and how do we shift our policies, our workplaces, our ideas about balance, the supports that we offer, that it isn't just custodial care, right? But we care about the quality of care for the children, right? And so I would ask, in addition to flexibility and what it means for the family, flexibility at the workplace, but what does it mean for what it's going to do for children's development and children's well-being?
Thank you so much. We had a question from Patricia Cho, who is joining from Hong Kong. She is in charge of the organization called CIFA, which actually is an association of family institutions in Asia. And I think you answered her question about fatherhood, and I think in Asia, probably more work has to be done to involve fathers in childcare. And the next question comes from the National Secretary for the Family in Brazil, Angela Gandra. And if I understand correctly, she's asking about the practical solutions through public policies and initiatives that depart from civil society. So what would be the civil society role? Do you cooperate with civil society? How do you see their role in promoting work-family balance? And should they advocate? What is your take on that?
I can say I'm not sure I entirely understand the question, but part of the question that I'm hearing anyway, at least the way it was presented, and I'm looking in the question and answer box to see if I can find it. But part of the answer, of course, is again the way we conceive of essentially what is right and what is wrong. In WEIRD, I've been using that acronym over and over again because that's where most of the research has been undertaken, at least the peer-reviewed research. Again, that's Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And that's the part that's important there, is that, in democratic societies, issues of equality, issues of fairness, issues of everybody having an opportunity to pursue their life dreams is a fundamental value. And whether or not those are universal and they should be applied in all places, again, I'm not the person who's the spokesperson for that, but underlying that are notions of what is a civil society. And so if we're going to embrace those kinds of value systems, well, then clearly, recommendations like seeing to it that we have the opportunity to give all women, all children, all men the opportunity to pursue full-time parenthood, full-time work, part-time work through whatever technological means is available, well, clearly that would be a way that a civil society would approach that in some way, shape, or form. However, if a civil society, emphasizes the collective good, an individual family member is less important than the overall well-being of the family in and of itself. Some people refer to that in various ways as a concept like familisimo in Latin American cultures, perhaps filial piety in Asian cultures might be something similar to that. They're the idea of, well, it might be okay for one individual to sacrifice their dreams, so to speak, for the betterment of the family. And in the work that I do with immigrant Latinos here in the United States, we see that often. Oftentimes, working men and working women will put themselves in harm's way for the benefit of their family so that they can send money back home to their native country in support of their families. So again, what it means for a civil society, again, that's a little less clear to me, but it is fundamentally, the answer does fundamentally rest in the notion of what is viewed as a civil society and how is it then that policies as it pertains to work and family then get enacted and they're in service to what ultimate good.
Thanks, Joe. I'll jump in. I see that Angela, and again, if I can call you by your first name, please call me Susan, has phrased it about changing a culture to promote a family first lifestyle. And I'm a big believer in, again, a very ecological framework and a systems view that everything is going to affect everything else. But if we start at a macro view in terms of our policies as well as our media messaging that have wider effects and ripple effects and come down and affect neighborhoods and communities and individuals, I think that's where we need to be paying our attention. And both structurally in terms of the policies, and again, remembering that a policy and a budget sends messages. It sends messages about where our values are, and our media messages reinforce what those values are, or a shifting idea of those values. I share with my students sort of media representations of families, from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s. And if you don't believe that the media either represents or can shift our idea of what family is, well, watch television for the last 60 years. I think the other thing, though, when we think about, if I look at literally the idea about a civil society, I'm going to again raise the idea of technology access. Because if we, and I very much view the use of technology, use of the internet, use of mobile technologies as a right. You can choose whether or not to use them, but to remove folks' access removes a right to communication, to information gathering, to information sharing. And so I think as a civil society, we need to pay attention to technology access as a right, and to take a look at who has access to technology. Again, if we look at that map from around the world, it is the more developed economies that have access to the internet, to wireless and use of phones and smartphones. And when they're critically essential to operation for work, and we're not even talking about work and family balance, but also access for more marginalized folks that are part of our society that we oftentimes will not think of, right? And so for those of us who are English speakers, we don't think anything about just being on the web and being able to access everything. Well, a lot of my students are first or second generation learners who assist their families. Another sort of flipped role in the family is where children are the technology experts for their parents, but they're also translating into languages because the web platforms that they're using, say for healthcare, for insurance, for social, whatever, are not in the language. And so, and also for ability, for sight, for hearing, and it's, and so I think it's critically important that as we are talking about a civil society and we are thinking about the role of technology sort of flexibly in our own sense of balance, it's a very privileged notion, really. When we think worldwide, to those who don't have access to the same technologies, the same reliable technologies, and the technologies that offer the affordances to all people.
I'd like to piggyback on that a little bit, because now I see Angela's comment, and I want to echo what Susan is mentioning. And then I also notice Ayamanohi's comment, and that is, part of the question harkens back to what I mentioned earlier, and that is, why is it that the business and the economy is the driving force of most public decisions, right? Of course, the United States just came out of an election cycle, so every elector is going to say, of course, family matters. But when we take a look at all decision making, how often does a policymaker say, well, what does that mean for families? Usually there's always an economic analysis that's done for any policy that's ever going to make its way to the floor, at least of the United States Senate or House of Representatives. I presume it's similar in other parts of the world. There's always an economic analysis. But how often is there, in fact, an analysis of the impact on families, right? That rarely is the case, because the assumption is that a strong economy is good for families. And so if we pursue a strong economy, we will have strong families. And that might be real, but that is really situated in a fundamental notion that families are the basic building block of society, right? That's a long-standing view, perhaps, again, at least in the United States, maybe around the world, that every society is built from its families, and that those families need to be supported by the economic infrastructure of those societies. But whether or not that's a true statement, or whether or not there's an alternative way of realizing a strong society through strong families first, as a way of growing strong economies, that's, again, just a different way of thinking about it. But at the end of the day, we've got lots of societies that say, yes, we are family first. But then when you take a look at their actions relative to their rhetoric, they're saying, no, economy first, and then hopefully all boats will rise to an equal level if we focus on the economy first. So that really is, next to the sort of male-female gender item, the notion of, are families a part and a driver of the economy, or do they benefit from an economy, is a fundamental question. And here in the United States, anyway, it's crystal clear. Capitalism and the ability to generate money is a much more valuable point of view than the wherewithal or the general good of the individuals who are in that economy.
And I'll piggyback on that. Because I probably would have to give back my parenting educator card if I didn't use the word parenting one more time before we leave. Because when we think about because I completely agree with everything Joe just said. And when I hear the word family, I break that down into what Joe and I teach in our worlds, which is family relationships and family cohesion and family connections and families needing to be flexible, right? And if we think about an essential function of the family, it is around producing our next generation. And that falls squarely on our shoulders, on Joe's shoulders, my shoulders, everybody's shoulders as parents. And parenting is in my world, it's the toughest job ever, right? It's the toughest job in the world. And it ain't getting any easier. And technology certainly, while it has certain benefits, right? When we also think of technology as a content area for parenting, when we think about parent decision-making around their children's use of smartphones and exposure to predators online and all of this stuff, parenting is becoming harder and harder. And so I would just ask too, in our vision that embraces families first, that we also break that down to beyond just family well-being are the essential functions of the family and to really support parents in their roles.
Thank you so much. Thank you for these very exhaustive answers to the questions. I think we left, we concluded on an important note that it's really the driving force, is behind the family-oriented policies, should be the pro-family culture really in society. So that is not always the case. I really am happy that this event had a large following and that we were able to have it on Facebook Live and also on as a on UN TV. If anyone joined later and was not able to see the whole event, you can go to our website and find the recording. We will have it by tomorrow, and also it will be archived on UN Web TV. So I think we can continue our discussion at our future events. I would like to turn your attention to the event that we'll have tomorrow at 10 a.m. It will be on the COVID-19 and families study. And our next major event we will celebrate will be in May, and that will be, of course, the International Day of Families. And that event will focus on new technologies and families, and will explore in more detail technological change and parenting education. And importantly, we will be launching the major research background paper on the use of new technologies in families, which is currently being finalized by Professor Walker. So I hope you can join us for our future event. Thank you so much for your participation, for your questions. And I hope to see you at our events. And I would like everyone to share their research or their activities, be it academics, civil society, government officials. Please share with us so we can continue this discussion and really advocate for family-oriented work-family and balance policies. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks so much, Renata. This was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Susan.
Yeah, it was fun. Joe, I appreciated piggybacking with you.
Great.
Thanks again. I hope everybody has a great day.
Yes.
Thank you. Have a
Thank you
great
both.
day.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Take care.
Claudia.
Bye
Thank
to
you,
you all.
Renata.